Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
So this is Michael Waits from Asia Tech Podcast Stories. We are here today with Dr. Snehal Patel to talk about a whole bunch of things: investing, MyDoc, the medical profession, tourism, a whole bunch of different things. How are you doing today?
I am doing really well.
You're in Singapore, right?
That's correct.
Are you originally from Singapore?
I am not, though I've been here 9 years, so it's starting to blend, I have to say. But originally born and raised in the U.S., moved out to Singapore in 2008.
So I'm from the United States as well, but I haven't lived in the United States for almost 30 years. I'm probably a little bit older than you, maybe a lot older actually. But where are you from originally?
So born and raised in Louisiana, so from New Orleans, so down south.
That is awesome.
But I moved up from grad school onwards, and I would say my sort of second home now is New York City, which is where I moved from to move to Singapore. So
that is awesome. So I have friends who actually have homes in New Orleans as well. I've never been down there for Mardi Gras and stuff, but I hear it's pretty insane sometimes.
Yeah, it's a great place.
So what brought you to Singapore originally?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting story from that. I was practicing in New York, looking to get into venture capital and early stage investing, and it sort of rounded up a couple of offers, one in the New York City area as well as one in California, which is, of course, the breadbasket of tech. Sure. But out of left field, really, I mean, and there was an opportunity arose at a large family office based here in Singapore to come out and initially focus on sort of emerging markets in the healthcare and education spaces. So we sort of, my fiance and my wife, actually just sort of rolled the dice. We're like, look, you know what? We've been in New York, love it a lot, but let's try to have an adventure and go somewhere else that would be interesting. And so we decided to move out to Singapore.
But this is actually even more interesting to me, actually. So you are a doctor,
yes,
a lawyer,
yes,
right? And that's both from Columbia, am I right?
That's right. Yeah.
And just what was the interest in venture capital? And just to give you a little bit of a background, so my brother's a neurosurgeon in Connecticut. His wife is a reconstructive hand surgeon and plastic surgeon. So very familiar with the medical profession. But what was it about venture capital or investing that got you so interested?
Great question, and it's one that let me skip ahead a bit. I actually ended up getting I'm a Kauffman Fellow, so the Kauffman Fellows program is a VC education seminar. I bring that up primarily because a lot of the folks that end up doing the Kauffman program are similar. We call ourselves misfits, overeducated, spend too much time jumping around industries, and we realized that when the great thing about venture investing is that it, in a way, brings together a lot of the different subspecialties you've picked up through your sort of career. So in my particular case, it was being a health practitioner, which I found very interesting, spent a lot of time learning about and training over. And then in the legal side, saying, okay, well, now that you have that background, how are you looking at putting together deals and that sort of thing? The logical construct of that is, okay, well, healthcare investing, it requires a bit of both, right? To really understand the sector, it does absolutely help to have some technical understanding of that space. At the same time, the legal side is essentially a proxy in many ways for business experience and whatnot in terms of understanding how deals get put together,
right,
diligence, etc. So yeah, that's sort of it seemed to make sense. Together.
I like this concept of sort of being a misfit and being overeducated, right? And I think the best part for me, because I do some venture capital, some angel investing as well. As you know, I'm a limited partner in the Ardent Capital portfolio. Yep. And for me, people ask me, like, what's the most interesting part about it? And I kind of agree with you. I get to look at new and different things every single day. And I know that sounds a little bit trite. Mm-hmm. But don't you find that, so what I'm curious, what kind of doctor, what kind of medicine were you practicing?
Yeah, so I trained as a surgeon, so it was general surgery initially. And then, in full disclosure, did not complete my residency. I did my residency, started it up in Boston.
Where?
So it was, at the Beth Israel Deaconess and Brigham and Women's Hospitals.
Brigham and Women's, okay.
Yeah, so the two of them, because in that same campus, rotated to children's and others. Got it. So obviously very prestigious and great, fantastic sort of co-residents and such. But
sure.
One day you just wake up and you realize this is great work, but for me, I felt that there was other things in healthcare that I could have impact on, and I wanted to sort of move and see what else I could do beyond, sort of the very noble art of being a clinician. So I think that's where my journey started and sort of moving back, initially focusing on sort of deal work and then VC and then entrepreneurship. So, and some people would say I did it backwards, but you always come to these, a journey's a journey. So you never know how it's going to really end up as you start off. So
yeah, I'm not really sure I understand the concept of doing it backwards, right? Like you said, because everybody's journey is really different, right? I mean, there are some people that may start in venture capital and actually end up being surgeons. It's not often, but all this kind of stuff can happen. Is there a history of medicine in your family?
Yes, like a good Asian American family, we have a ton of doctors in our family. So my father's a physician, sister, brother-in-law, cousins, you name it. So I was a black sheep in some ways because had to say, okay, well, we're going to spend all the time and money and effort to go through this whole practice. I think at some level my mom still doesn't understand it.
I was going to say she was so proud of you when you graduated from med school and probably got your JD as well. And then people ask her now, and she's like, I don't know, he lives in Singapore.
Yeah, does something there or something with a new company or something.
A new company.
So I guess tech is now becoming pretty prestigious in its own right, so it's okay. But
yeah, no, it's funny because I was talking to another founder today of his own company. He has a family business, and I won't say medicine is like a family business, but there's a certain amount of pressure depending on where you fall inside of your family for what you're meant to do, right? So as the oldest son in my family, without giving up sort of my background, I had really two choices. I was either going to be a lawyer or a doctor, and I didn't want to be a lawyer, and I really hate the sight of blood. So my brother, I let him be the doctor. And I've been investing my whole life. So for me, again, I was the black sheep of my family too, and I kind of understand that whole feeling. Yeah. And so tell me this though: you move out to Singapore, you start working for a family office, and you start looking for opportunities in sort of the health investment sector. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, the company that I ended up sort of coming over for was, like I said, a large family office, and the founder was a sort of a unique guy. He was self-made, or took a modest family fortune, was able to translate that into a large sum of capital. Wow. And for him, initially most of his capital was earned in the public market space, but he was quite interested as he would go in, and he was exclusively would invest in early stage, or I would say early emerging markets. So high risk but high yield. Was looking at saying, look, if I'm actually helping spur or providing capital for the public markets, it would be really interesting to look at things at the really early stage, more the entrepreneur side. And that sort of really dovetailed nicely with what I was looking to do at the time. With no real sort of plan. I mean, it was more like, look, have some capital, we'll mentor you guys, but let's get out there, let's start to make some investments, understand, we're not going to make it, perfect from day one, right? But we'll learn as we go, and we'll start to hopefully make an impact. So I think that was great. I mean, for me, it was opportunistic. Like I think a lot of people say, luck is a big part of any equation. For sure. So to have that opportunity was a massive break to actually be able to learn about the intricacies of the Asian healthcare sort of ecosystem, while being paid well and sort of understanding it from the perspective of an investor, which I think is pretty unique. It's really unique, actually. Can I just interrupt you for a second? It sounds like someone's doing the dishes or something behind you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think there's a little construction outside that unfortunately got louder. Yeah, we can try. Give us 1 second. Let's if you just kind of relocate a little bit. It's not that bad, but I just don't want other people to be annoyed when they're listening to it. I personally find the conversation fascinating. Let's see if I can. Is this one? Yeah. Hello? Yeah, I think it actually got a little bit louder. Oh, it got louder. Weird. Okay. Let's see. It's not loud enough. Is that loud? It's loud in here. It's not. Let's see, Michael. Maybe we should just move further away from the... You know what? This is just one of the vagaries of being in a growing economy. You just have to... This room is definitely a lot quieter, or it's cut off everywhere else, so it should be okay. Can you hear me? It's okay? I can. It now sounds like you're a little bit of a wind tunnel, but it sounds better. That's actually much better. But I think it's actually quite funny, right? So we're in a region where we say there's a lot of growth, where it's like the next big thing is coming, and then in the background there's construction noise. It's actually the perfect metaphor for the conversation we're having. Absolutely, absolutely.
So tell me your approach to risk. Like most people who don't exist in the public markets and haven't actually been investing their whole lives or haven't been brought up in an investing environment, right? Their first trip up is, how do I handle risk? How do I manage risk? How do I understand what that risk is? And you've kind of looked at this from both sides, right? Because you started off on the investment side and now you're actually in the entrepreneurship side, which are two different levels of risk. But I'm curious how you got introduced to that. Were you mentored by us? How did that work? And then we'll switch to the entrepreneurship side, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I mean, the company that I ended up getting the offer from, and where I started my sort of career out here in Asia, the entrepreneur, the founder, was actually someone who really mentored us in a way. I mean, sort of saying, look, the kind of work that he had done over 20 years to raise his considerable amount of wealth. Pretty shocking, and his ability, to kind of stay the course when things look pretty bumpy. So there was a lot of discussion in terms of, he has a very sort of contrarian approach to investing. He really looked at sort of as opportunities from a macro perspective. So he was very much against sort of what we see now as in the public markets, the quant-driven sort of approach.
Oh, tell me about that. Actually, I have my own views on this. So he was opposed to the quant-driven approach to investing.
Yeah, because, I mean, from his perspective is like if you have enough capital where you can weather the ups and downs and you really believe in the overall macro growth story of whatever it is, the company, the sector, the country that you're investing in,
right,
that ultimately, if you stay the course, you're going to reap the rewards of that persistence. And, on one hand, that seems very simplistic and sort of, it's kind of elegantly simple, but it's very hard to do at the time when your portfolio may be down 60%, 70% because you've hit, maybe a correction or something.
Well, right? Look, the hardest problem for a human investor is their emotion, right? So
correct.
So
correct.
Like I said, so I was in the public markets for years, and the hardest thing is really just to stay the course, right? If you really believe but it really is, right? If you really believe in the long-term macro story,
yeah,
then
exactly.
you're a buy and hold. But if you don't, then you're just are you really trading for ticks? Because this is the question that I used to ask other investors. Are you a tick trader, really? Because if you are, then I find that really boring. But if you're a fundamental long-term holder or shorter, I don't care. Either way is fine with me. Yeah. If you don't believe the story, then sell it for sure.
Exactly. And that was literally we would go back and forth on some discussion about a particular investment, or even as we started to build our own businesses, and it always come back to a very, very simple but basic equation. It's like, look, Snehal, do you believe in the story that we're going after? Yes or no? It's kind of a binary. If it's a no or sort of on the fence, then get out. We should be doing something else. But if you really believe in it and you can back that up, that's not just a gut instinct thing, because that's not good enough.
Nope.
But you can back it up on sort of a much broader sort of vantage point, then let's stay the course. Let's double down. Let's continue to focus on that point, because he would tell us, in my history, every time I've checked my emotions at the door, I see a momentary massive drop, but I stayed the course. I've always been vindicated in the long run. And I think that's something that is being lost in this sort of rush to be able to get your tick, as you say,
right.
In the short term, because I'm not interested in short term. I'm interested in staying the course for a long term, much bigger upside. So,
right. So my view on this has always been that market dislocations are opportunities for profit. So if the market dislocates either up or down, so if it's just too exuberant, you sell it, right? And that it means it creates sort of a long-term view that's going to go down.
Yeah.
So, take any kind of sort of tragedy or big market move event, right? So like when Greenspan, I think it was in 1990, I can't remember when he said, the markets are experiencing irrational exuberance. And they got sold off, 30% or whatever it was. That was a buying opportunity. And it was an obvious buying opportunity to anybody who'd been in the markets. But those types of events happen all the time. And what's interesting to me, and I'm curious for your view on this as well, is that I think that happens in the private markets as well, but it's just not as easy to spot.
I totally agree with you, and it absolutely does. And I think the highs are higher, the lowers are lower, right? I mean, it's because of the fact that you don't have the compensation that you have in the public markets by having sort of different people on the sidelines flooding into the market to correct, quote unquote, correct what may be an overcorrection or undercorrection. You have to wait for that entire wave to go out. For the market to crater before you start to get new capital into the market. So I think that's part of the trick, right? And if you look at it from the perspective of a VC, an early stage investor, you have those same sort of discussions when you're trying to raise capital from LPs, right? So how do I structure it? It's very interesting because your point being exactly when you started off with, Michael, about this idea that it is all about emotion, right?
It is.
And that's why the rational investor hypothesis that the Chicago school theory is now being sort of pushed aside because it doesn't make sense, right? We do have these biases that we have to work with.
Correct. So, what's your view? So in the public markets, there's much less of what I call information arbitrage.
Right.
Because there are rules, obviously, around disclosure, and because there are so many people involved in the public markets, information travels faster. In the private markets, whether it's venture capital or private equity, it does seem to me that there's an information arbitrage available, and I'm wondering what your view on that is.
Totally agree with you. I mean, and that's sort of if you look at it's exactly as you sort of laid out from the perspective of the fact that if you're in that market and you're operating a business, and you've done the proper sort of diligence when it comes to looking at that business as an investor, what you're able to sort of uncover if you have the proper tools at hand are going to put you at either strategic advantage over other potential investors, right?
Right.
And when sort of hype-driven bubbles occur, if you're looking at it with clear eyes and you also, once again, are in that market, it becomes easier for you to spot those opportunities. So I agree with you. I think that's part of the reason why the highs are higher and the lows are lower, because the fact that there is the arbitrage comes from the fact that there is an asymmetry that can't be rectified quickly.
Right. You're right. And you actually bring up a great word. I like that word. Actually, the asymmetry is what creates the opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So the dislocations create asymmetry. Noticing the asymmetry creates the opportunity. And to me, and again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, but to me, in the private markets, right, so if this year, and I'm going to make something up, right, but I think it's indicative of how some of the people in the private markets work, right? If this year, artificial intelligence and machine learning are the big thing, it means that things like maybe virtual reality and artificial, and that type of stuff kind of falls off, and that's where the opportunity to invest in those things, when it's not like the big new thing.
Yeah.
You get an opportunity to have information arbitrage around that, right?
I agree.
And sentiment arbitrage, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but Gardner publishes the hype cycle, right?
Yes. That's my favorite.
I love it because it's exactly as you sketch out, right? People will hype it up, and then there's a trough of disillusionment, and then eventually you get this sort of steady state where the technology or whatever the tech du jour has made it to a point where it's become mainstream and stable and accepted. And that it's sort of there's no more symmetry there or no more arbitrage to be had, but it's a successful sort of technology. I love it because every time they publish that, just seeing where the various technologies that we're talking about, whether it be Bitcoin one year, AR another year, telemedicine, whatever it is, they all fall on different sides of that curve, and you can see it kind of reflected in hindsight being 2020, but you can see it being reflected as kind of how they sketch it out. So I love that.
Yeah, I love it. I love it too, because you can see it affect the private market valuations of individual companies or just sectors, and you're like, that's too expensive, I'm going to wait. And actually it does come down. And we can see multiple examples of that in Southeast Asia, which we can address later. So are you still investing now?
Less so. I mean, when I left the fund, I left with two other senior people in that fund to set up our vehicle. The investment vehicle is called Saena Partners.
Right.
And what's been great about that is that there's three of us. We all keep each other sane. We all have different perspectives on the way we invest. But our capital base is the same. So when we end up, our model is quite different in the perspective that we launch our own company. So we're the entrepreneurs with sort of our own capital base at the front end, but with two other partners, right?
Right.
And that's where we started off. So we made some small angel investments in other external businesses to start off with, but then we quickly started transition to this company builder model, which
right.
For us it was just much more. I guess it was more intuitive to us. So it's something that we really wanted to do. We saw market gaps. We really wanted to exploit them. One of us would be, look, I get it, and I'm really charged to go and make this company successful and really grow the business. So that's sort of what we do. So, long answer to your question, not really doing active investments as much these days because I think we're focusing on the companies that we're building at this point.
So, how does that work? So do you focus on specific sectors or not at all? Like I kind of like this concept of the sort of building venture capitalists, right? The operating venture capitalists. So I think it works really well, right? And if you look at, if you look at businesses in the United States that do this, right? So Science probably does this a little bit in the US, and there are other funds that do this as well. And I kind of like their methodology. And you brought up another word. I like this actually. The market gaps. I talk about this all the time. If you're involved and building things, it's so much easier to see the gap in the market, because in the context of building what you're building, you think, if I just had this thing, I'll build that thing.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I mean, I think that's where we spend a lot, at least at the front end, that's where we spend most of our time saying, okay, we are really passionate about a sector. To answer your first question, the three of us have different sort of strengths, and we're all actually lawyers at some level, but then have different sort of other qualifications. So for me, it was healthcare, which is an obvious sort of point of focus for me. Within those verticals, we say, what's addressable? What are the gaps in the market? Let's not overcome. This is something we learned from our mentor, or prior boss, saying, look, everyone wants to complicate things. The world is complicated, but essentially, successful businesses fill gaps. That's what they do.
Right.
And if you're the right person, you got to execute, and you have the winds have to blow your way as well. There's other factors involved, but just identify a proper gap. And if you identify that, you can build a business to fill it. So that's really been our mentality, I guess.
Right. So if you're looking at the healthcare sector, what do your partners look at?
We have a business that's doing, I would say, back office, so fintech, because it's less tech, but more operations management, because we feel like in this space and in this market, you have high-end sort of consultancies, the big four, et cetera, that manage the books and sort of the operations of large companies. But for SME startups, there's kind of a gap in that space. So we built a company around that. Essentially, it was a spin-off from our own internal sort of compliance mechanism that we sort of now is doing well. It's serving a lot more clients now. And you're going to laugh, but we also have a high-end luxury sort of spirits business, which is connected to F&B outlets.
What's the name of that business?
So, the one that's probably most well known in this region is a bar called 28 Hong Kong Street.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's one of the. I think the 6th year it's been recognized as one of the world's top 50 bars. And there's a business that spun off from that, which is about providing the high-end spirits that a lot of these establishments need to sort of provide cocktails for their customers. It's called Proofing Company, and so they work with a lot of the big restaurants and hotels, and not just in Singapore, but actually now we're in China, Southeast Asia. So it's got a pretty big footprint.
But I love this. You actually opened a bar. Just like a physical bar. And is there a differentiating? No, I love it. But is there, and this is why I love these conversations, right? Because you can get on the phone with someone, you can see that they're, an MDJD, that in and of itself is interesting. And you can see that they run a company called MyDoc, which frankly we haven't talked about yet, but I really want to talk about that too, because that seemed to be the focus of this, which is not, which makes me super happy. And then we find out that you're also running a bar called 28 Hong Kong Street. Well, is there some differentiating thing there? Is it just the customer service? Is it a cocktail? Like, what is the thing that makes it so good and so different?
Yeah, so essentially, my two business partners at Saena, we all hail from New York in some capacity, and I think when we were there was we would go out and there's a lot of, at the time, this cocktail renaissance that was taking place, which was quite interesting. You'd go and have a cocktail that was being made from a recipe that was sort of lost to time. But then, a couple of sort of pioneers had brought it back. When we moved to this region, the three of us were working for the VC private equity fund.
Got it.
We realized when we left, we're like, look, we wanted to set Saena Partners up. And that's going to be our sort of lodestar. But let's try to figure out, something that's interesting that we can sort of, I don't know, just get our hands dirty with. I think all our partners and wives and girlfriends and whatnot all thought we were having an early midlife crisis.
Right, you're too young. You're too young for that. No?
Sort of like the question in which you would ask when you're like, oh, so you're running this, you're working with this multi-billion-dollar family office, and now you've opened a bar. So it's a fair analysis, I have to say.
Fair enough.
The gap was really simple. It was, once again, going back to this market gap piece. You have in Singapore at the time, and obviously now, a very high-end, international sort of crowd.
Yep.
People who come from London, from New York, from San Francisco, from you name it. And this is Singapore really for Southeast Asia has become that sort of collecting jar for a lot of high-end sort of people that are world travelers,
yep.
elites, etc. But on top of which, even the Singaporeans that we'd met are people who have traveled tremendously. It's a very sort of rich and vibrant sort of society here. And we look around and you'd have sort of the classic bars and, whatever restaurants, et cetera, but it wasn't as dynamic is in markets like in London, New York. So we said, look, it just would seem if you put 2 plus 2 equals 4, if we put in a product that was high-end quality, that was really ministering to people what they were expecting in a market with this much sort of wealth and sophistication, we'd probably be able to, grab a couple of dollars.
Right.
And that was really what it was. And it was motivated also authentically because we really are passionate about that space. So you put the two together and we were like, look, let's open a bar. It's a speakeasy. We're going to set it up in a part of town that makes sense geographically. It's between, the central business district and a big sort of area where there's a lot of restaurants and shopping called Clark Quay.
Yep.
But the middle streets were kind of quiet then. There was nothing there. So real estate was low cost. So we're like, okay, well, this is an arbitrage opportunity. So we can actually sort of use the parlance of being good entrepreneurs, getting an asset at a low cost, put something in there, and then really spending time and effort to make sure that it is the best of its type. And I think, and once again, we benefited from timing, right? We were able to launch that right at the beginning of what has now become, arguably, if you talk to people who know in the industry, Singapore really is in the top 5 cities in the world when it comes to sophistication of F&B, and so we happen to catch the upswing on that. So I think that's, there's a lot of those different factors that go together. So yeah, but you're right. It's not what I would typically connect the dots with when we look at our backgrounds. But makes life interesting.
It does, and I also find it interesting that you used the word arbitrage when you were talking about opening the bar. And tell me if you, but tell me if you disagree with this, right? Do you find that your mind is constantly thinking like an investor, even in situations where you're not investing money per se to get a return, but you're doing the same type of analysis in the sense that you're thinking, because the bar is a different story, but in your regular life where you're thinking, tonight I want to go out and have dinner with my wife, but it's Thursday. So you go through that whole analysis process when you're doing that, thinking like an investor? Do you know what I mean? Like, does it dominate? Because I'll tell you why I'm asking. Because for me, it does. To me, everything looks like an investment or a trade.
Okay.
And some of them are more long-term and some of them more short-term. And only because I did that for so long that my mind kind of works that way. And I'm wondering how you think about that. Only because you've said that word a bunch of times.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, I think that's where straddling this weird sort of nexus, which, as you pointed out way earlier, is quite common these days between an entrepreneur and an investor.
Right.
It becomes quite interesting. I tweak what you just said and say that for me, I'm almost looking at gaps. Like, I mean, it's really like, it's basically the same thing. Yeah, different side of the same coin, right? Essentially saying, look, wow, this is pretty neat. Or why don't they have a service that does X in your middle of whatever it is?
Right.
So yeah, definitely, I can't help think that way because you're always thinking about, it's not about the money necessarily, but just kind of the excitement of being, look, if I can launch that, that's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. I can actually bring something into the world that didn't exist, and actually, it'll make money, but it'll just be successful of some sort, right?
Right.
So I think that's probably the entrepreneurial side of it that's really kind of pushing. But
it reminds me when in 2006 or 2007, I went on vacation with a friend of mine who was running his own business. It must have been 2006. And he'd never worked at a big company before. He'd never worked at a company. He'd always ran his own thing. And we were, this is going to sound really bourgeoisie, but I'm going to say it anyway. We were, it's like call a spade a spade. Anyway, we were sitting around the pool and he said to me, because we were on vacation, he said to me, can I ask you a question? He said, when you're on vacation, are you still getting paid? And I hadn't thought about it. I was like, that's the dumbest question. And in the middle of my thought process, I'm like, no, actually, that's interesting, right?
That is awesome.
It's so awesome, right? And because for me, I had always worked at, whether it was Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or Citigroup or whatever, it was always, I was getting a paycheck whether I was in the office or not, for good or for better or for worse, right?
Yeah.
But now, so I haven't had a job per se for 5 years, and everything that I've created from scratch. And that feeling, like you said, of it's not the money, it's that ability to look at nothing and conceptualize something and then turn it into something.
So, yeah, absolutely. And I love, and it may be bourgeoisie, but I love that anecdote because I've had similar conversations with folks, and it's a little kind of tangential, but related in the sense that people, we have our long weekends coming up, and we have now a lot of employees through the various companies that we have, and we obviously want them recharged and taking the proper amount of time off. And I'm not just saying that to sort of sound right. I agree. It's pretty clear that, in fact, Well, if I had my druthers, people would be working nonstop, and then they would take a proper break, take 2 weeks off, literally throw everything away, and
Right.
don't even talk, don't even communicate. Right? That's how I recharge. But anyway, to your point, when people say, "Oh yeah, it's great, we have a long weekend coming up," and I remember when we first had stepped off from our nice, well-paid, weekly paid or monthly paycheck job, I'm like, actually, long weekends are the cruelest times because we're still paying money for rent. We're still paying money for salary.
Right.
I'm not getting paid because we're not generating revenue, and I'm still working. So
Yeah.
I can totally identify with that feeling.
Right.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly asking people what day it is, and I think they think that I'm just taking the piss out of them, but I actually don't really know. And to be fair, and maybe you can counter this if you think that I'm wrong, but I'm having more fun now than I've ever had in my whole life, and on a month to month basis, I'm earning way less income, but it doesn't matter because it's like we said earlier, I'm taking a long term view on myself, right?
Uh-huh.
That's the trade I'm making, and that's probably the trade you're making too. About like I'm investing long term in me, and that's a much better trade.
I totally agree. Totally agree with you. And I think pointing out what you just pointed out, I think is something that for people who are thinking about making that plunge from, a very cushy, very high paid, but also a very prestigious job into sort of the abyss of startups. And
the abyss.
It's something that you think about, but at the end of the day, if you don't get that feeling that you just sort of put your finger on, it may not be the right course for you. And I say this, I get asked to speak at some of the local universities about entrepreneurship, which I'm actually very thankful that the government here and even the university systems and I think education in general has started to identify that entrepreneurship is something that's really important, creativity. Right. But I make this point, and I don't think the instructors like it when I do it, but I do it anyway when I start off. There may be 200 students in this classroom as an intro course on entrepreneurship. And I'll just look around and say, look, this is great. You guys are all interested, and it's absolutely the right thing for you to know about. That being said, of the 200 people in this class, probably 2 of you guys should actually do this.
Right.
It's not. I know it's kind of the sexy, cool thing to be an entrepreneur these days, but it's. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by denigrating I think as a net logical result. I think this happens. The absolutely important jobs of being that high paid person at Goldman Sachs, or whatever it is, because the entire market works only if all these different pieces are properly sort of resourced. And to mention on top of which, I really do think that the psychological makeup of people who it's not about being successful as an entrepreneur, just being able to withstand the pressures and the rigors of it.
Right.
It's not a common trait, as I think a lot of other more knowledgeable people have sort of have illustrated. But I think it's something that's worth sort of making sure that we are all on the same page on. So.
I agree, and I look at this sort of from 2 perspectives. One is if you look at the mid to late '60s in the United States, it was probably really cool to aspire to be an astronaut, but most people couldn't put up with the stress associated with doing it.
Exactly, that's great. That's true.
as cool as it is, and the other thing I believe is just like charisma, right? You cannot teach people how to be comfortable with risk. So you can have a class of 200 students who learn about entrepreneurship, and everybody should learn about it because even if you don't do it, you have to be able to put it into context so you can understand what your cousin's doing, what your aunt is doing, and why they're doing it. But you also have to understand what's not right for yourself. And I think you make a really great point. Out of those 200 kids, it's probably right for 2 of them. And that statistically, actually, that's probably right on par. Yeah. 1%, maybe it's a little bit higher, but at the most. But it doesn't mean you don't teach them about it because, again, some people learn chemistry and don't turn into chemists. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just awareness, right? I mean, the more awareness we have about the type of work that folks are doing, I think it does help make sure the ecosystem fits together properly. So
I agree. So tell me a little bit. We don't have so much time left, which is in a way which is awesome for me, right? So at some point in 2012, you said, I'm a healthcare professional. I'm a well-trained doctor. I understand the legal side of things. I have this itch to start my own company. And then can you tell me about the genesis of MyDoc, like how that happened and maybe a little bit of the story behind that, how the founding went, who the people are, all that kind of stuff. I'm really curious because the follow-on question to that is going to have to be, it's a crowded field, right?
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
But it doesn't mean, and again, I look at a whole bunch of things sort of in an analogous way, and that is, there's Breyer's ice cream, there's Ben and Jerry's, there's Haagen-Dazs. Like there's a flavor for everybody, right? So it doesn't mean there's only one company that's going to win in any one particular sector. So I'm curious how it started, what the difference is, and like, how it's going as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, how it started, I'll sort of bring us back to the Saena Partners example. So, myself, my two partners, for me, what I really brought to the table was my prior 4 years of experience with our private equity or family office,
right,
exploring on the ground how, and our focal point for the healthcare business was very much outpatient focused. It actually to this day it drives me nuts that when people think of healthcare, the first, and this is a word association game I've done multiple times.
Tell me.
The first thing that people think about when they think of healthcare, they think of a hospital.
Right.
And that I think is that's actually indicative of the big problem that we face when it comes to healthcare. Yes, the hospital is a very important part of that equation, but it's only one part. And actually, if you look at the number of services that are offered in the healthcare space, it is actually a small percentage. I mean, in terms of the number of people that actually consume healthcare services, that actually consume the services in a hospital, it's in the teens.
Interesting.
So we need to sort of dismiss or change that sort of paradigm. And so with my family office, the focal point was very clearly on the much larger outpatient space. That includes everything from your GP, your specialist, to going and picking up, OTC drugs at Guardian or whatever it is, right? Like all these different touch points are actually part of our healthcare system. And in many ways, that part is the part where we can, if we properly structure solutions around it, we can start to drive people away from the hospital so that we catch them earlier on. We're able to sort of prevent sort of issues before they become, well, not forget the expense, but also the pain and the suffering. And so that's what we did. And our model there was we looked at markets like Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Philippines. What was interesting was that even though those markets are quite different in many ways, culturally, linguistically, the similarities in the fact that the outpatient ecosystem was similarly fragmented, which means to say there was no connectivity whatsoever between the different parts of that equation, was the striking similarity. And what we would do as a good PE sort of shop would do from that perspective is do roll-ups. You'd buy the different assets, put them into one brand, change the brand, and it worked well. Like you'd end up creating common standards, SOPs, SLAs.
Yep.
So the classic sort of operational playbook to make sure that what you're doing fits a certain standard. And people came, and it was successful because of that. When I stepped off, though, what I realized was part of the reason stepping off was like, look, if I wanted to build my own business and sort of leverage that experience set, I need to really think more deeply about how to do that in a much more capital efficient manner.
Right.
I don't have billions of dollars, and I don't want to raise that kind of money to be able to do this. And that's when tech came in. And to be completely transparent, at that point, I was always a gadget freak, and I still am to this day. But it was not as if I had a comp sci background or really understood that space from an intuitive level. But what I realized was that if I had the right sort of wing person, a co-founder that did, I think we could be pretty formidable in terms of creating a solution that essentially took 80% of the market in healthcare, which is outpatient care, and stitching together the component pieces that currently are completely fragmented. And that fragmentation leads to all sorts of things, leading from errors to wastage of resources to just, essentially people falling through the cracks where they end up in the hospital. So that was like the simple big idea. Like, okay, you pitch it to people and they look at me like you're completely crazy. That just makes no sense. Because
but why?
How the hell are you going to start a company and bring together large, entrenched, very difficult to change organizations and stitch them together? That's just stupid. It doesn't make any sense. And we heard that a lot. And what we were told oftentimes was like, well, why don't you just do the simple, what we know works in tech, which is you've got a buyer, seller, print a marketplace, right? That's what you should be doing. But every time, so it was myself, my co-founder. My co-founder is also a physician, so that's the other sort of weird wrinkle in our founding story is that the two of us were both doctors, which is quite rare actually when it comes to health tech. But the similarity ended there in the sense that my co-founder had founded a prior health tech business, a teleradiology business here in Singapore, Singaporean physician, and so he brought to the table, to the two of us, sort of the experience on the tech side. And so that's sort of when we started comparing notes, we said, look, we'd be a good founding team. We think we would be because we're sort of complementary, even though our sort of core sort of value prop is the fact that we're both physicians, or at least trained in medicine. So that helps us understand the nuances of a sector that can be quite complex.
Right.
So skipping back to where I was originally, in terms of we just reject the vision of this buyer market, the buyer-seller marketplace, because I have yet, and I spent a lot of time sort of understanding the business models in the U.S. that sort of had predated what we were doing. And the buyer-seller marketplace for healthcare just it never sat well with me, because it doesn't really, it's not similar to the way the healthcare is administered. And I mean, we can all agree that healthcare is inefficient, it's bureaucratic, et cetera, but I also realize that it's not one of those things like an Uber that's going to be wiped away by the fact that we created a teleconsult app, but for a doctor and a patient.
No, it's too complex and too many moving pieces.
Exactly. And so for us, we went contrarian. We said, look, we're going to do what no one thinks will ever work, is we're going to actually disrupt the space by working with it.
Right.
In other words, let's look at the big guys, realize that they are the gap, and the sort of my analogy or my sort of metaphor of the market gap was that you'd have big organizations that want to do things that are quote unquote innovative, and they know they need to get out and start engaging their patients or customers in a way that drives costs down but increases convenience. But they are so sort of legacy bound that they don't know how to do that. And what we can do is sort of show that actually, partner A, big insurer, for example, with partner B, pharmacy, partner C being clinical group, if we provide the plumbing that connects those different services that are currently offline,
oh my God,
legacy, we now all of a sudden have created this much more virtuous cycle that works within their existing frameworks, but also provides an entire new service layer. And that's sort of that was the vision from day one. And then we spent 2 years, literally, not literally, but basically metaphorically sloughing around the mud trying to make it happen. And I mean, honestly, we hit exactly all the barriers that all the naysayers said first, it's going to take you way too long to close your clients, and it's going to take too much time. And that's all true. I'm not going to sit here and deny any of it. It took us a damn long time. But, this is where that persistence point comes in. And I can harken back to what my mentor said. He was like, look, if you really believe in it, and this is not some sort of kumbaya.
No, not at all. No, not at all. I get that. I get that.
Keep going toward the wall and just keep banging your head against the wall. Maybe the wall will move. That's not going to happen, right?
No.
But the macro here was pretty clear.
Right.
You've got everything that we know about Asia, right? You've got a rapidly urbanizing sort of middle class, people who are taking to their devices like no other group in the world. A generally sort of innovative population, or innovation sort of embrace population. You don't have sort of the hang-ups around privacy you have in the U.S. So you put all that into a big pot, mix it, and you say, okay, on top of that, I'm going to drop rapidly increasing healthcare costs, not just because of the increase in sort of premiums, et cetera, but because governments, in fact, by adding more services, which is a good thing, to their baseline plans, are driving costs up, right? So all this stuff in a big stew, you're like, look, this is not going to work well. This is not going to end up in a position where pressure is going to just naturally dissipate. They're going to need solutions to fix this. And if we can provide a layer that allows us to do two things. One is drive costs down by increasing convenience. We have built ourselves a pretty credible, I would say, niche, but in sort of the Peter Thiel version, the monopoly that we want to build. We're the best in this market when it comes to being able to create that structure.
Right.
And so that's what we did. And I think to date we're pretty happy with our sort of progress. In terms of our partnerships, we've got some really blue chip companies on board.
I saw that.
The AXA and AIAs, the corporate side. Singapore is great to launch a product like this because you do get access to the MNC headquarters of all the big companies in the world.
Right.
So I think those pieces are really becoming realizable. And then finally, the kicker was, the hypothesis was that if we do that and we're working with these big sort of groups, we might be able to surmount what tends to be the biggest issue for startups in Southeast Asia, which is how do you expand from market to market? And especially for B2C, typically you start from scratch. You may have a good brand, but then you have to start your sales and marketing, your operations all from scratch. What we're seeing is that we're now able to go into new markets quickly because of our client list,
right,
who are all pan-regional. So for us to be able to launch with, an AXA in another market, that's pretty easy because, okay, they already know us, and it's actually an easier process because we've been de-risked, right? The Singapore team's already done all that hard work for them. So I think that's sort of the last piece of where we see this going and how we intend to sort of to scale based on the relationships we've built to date.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say except this. First of all, this is a great place to end. I've got so many more questions, but I don't want to take up any more of your time. But the second thing I want to say is this, is that you have completely encapsulated, using your business as an example, my entire investment thesis. And let me repeat it for you just so you know that I'm not talking out of my ears. And that is, You take a fragmented market, okay, using technology, you scale it and consolidate it, and you build another layer in the middle of it. You can say on top. I like to say in the middle. And then but again, it's just semantics, right?
Yeah, of course.
It's just a semantic difference, but it's the same. You're saying the same thing. And I think if you can build a business that works along with existing businesses, the money's already there, the clients are already there, but it's very fragmented. You consolidate that using tech. You build that other layer so that now every outpatient location, which before was completely disconnected, hence the fragmentation, is now connected somehow. Now you've got a potentially massive business. And I, like you, I don't necessarily believe in any particular vertical because inside that ecosystem, because I can't guess necessarily which one of those vertical providers is going to succeed or fail. But I do know that type of service is going to succeed. But if I build that layer, everyone's going to have to plug into my layer, and I'm going to be the success. Yeah, right. That's how I feel. So that's what you've built. Yeah,
I mean that's the hypothesis, and that's what we're building. Exactly, that's exactly right.
Okay, I love it. Sorry, I don't even know how we ended up at this place, but that's kind of where I wanted to end up today. I think today was actually fascinatingly interesting to me. I hope it was interesting to you as well.
Yeah, that very awesome.
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to end here, not because I think it's a great place to end, but just because I don't want to take up too much of your time, right? It's getting late in Singapore. I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this. And what I also want to ask you is, will you come back on the show again? I like to follow up.
Yeah.
Because I like to not stew about it, but I like to think about it. I like to ponder it. And then later on, I like to have some kind of experts in a field, and you're clearly the expert in this field with the combination of, the MD, the JD, the business, the investing, both inside and outside of, venture capital, but also sort of the medical and health tech sector, which I actually love. I mean, I've done a lot of work on this, and I've spoken to a lot of people on it. Is there a link or some type of way that people can get in touch with you, or that you'd like to share with people that I can put in the show notes, or that you'd like to talk about now? And then when we publish this, which will be over the next couple of weeks, people will know where to find you and how to get in touch with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, our website has a contact us page.
Right.
Would that be the easiest thing to do?
Yeah, for sure. I'm already there, right? MyDoc.
Yeah.
And the About Us, and there's a contact page there.
Yeah.
And how about, can I ask you one more question about Saena Partners? Do you take,
sure.
It's not a GPLP structure, right? It's your own principal money that you invest, or do you raise money from outside? And if you do, is it only kind of after you've done the proof of concept?
Yeah, so exactly. It's not an LPGP structure. It's just our capital.
Got it.
We keep it captive for that reason. We wanted to make it sort of, and we're not. I wish one day it's a family office. We're nowhere near at this point. Essentially, in that sense, it's private capital, but it's also the ability for us to. I mean, look, I think the benefit. Entrepreneurship on your own is a very difficult game.
Yeah.
As you all know, it's really tough. And I actually think that one of the things that my partners at the Saena level have been able to provide me is the ability that they've known me for almost, we knew each other in New York, so they're close friends, but they know my biases. They know where I can go off, right? And I trust them to pull me back. I think that's one of those things that are very, very important in order to create sort of successful business or anything in life.
Yeah.
So that's really our model. Like, look, we'll always keep that sort of our captive. We do raise money at the actual OpCo level. I mean,
right.
MyDoc has been venture funded, and we've got great angels, etc. But that's the Saena model has always been the three of us to try to okay, I'm not day to day, I'm not, we may not even be on the board, but we're going to sit down, have a beer, we're going to discuss the issues, and it's going to be much more hard. It's going to be much more direct stuff. It's not about sort of the surface issues that you're having. What are you really? What's keeping you up at night? What are you really sort of having a philosophical quandary over? And let me, give me some advice on that.
Yeah, and I do love the idea of having partners that know you really well and can actually, again, know your biases, your own inconsistencies, and can actually rein you back in or push you further along in places where that's necessary as well.
Exactly.
Oh, this has been a super conversation, really. I hate getting off the phone, but I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It takes a lot of organizational time and a lot of mental energy, but I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be able to get you back on the show in the future to just continue the conversation.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate it. No, it's been a great conversation as well on my side. It's always great to hear and meet sort of people, kindred folks, I guess, in some ways. That's kindred spirits. People who think similarly. I think it's exciting, right? It's exciting the kind of work we're doing, and appreciate it.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.